As people will likely be aware, we are in a period of reform where a number of the national bodies within the Scottish education system, such as Education Scotland and the SQA, are going through a period of change and improvement. That is very much being driven by consultation of a very broad and wide range of stakeholders. So similarly, Argyll and Bute Council are looking to replicate that and to propose and potentially bring about changes which take us alongside the national context and ensure that the service we are providing for our children and young people is as strong as it can be.
The collective leadership model is currently a proposal which has been consulted upon. It's an extensive consultation involving all staff in school, involving parents, involving pupils, involving the communities. I'm personally passionate about this model because I think we're at a crucial point where we need to plan for change. I think this transformational change is aspirational, but I do think that it will future-proof our schools in Argyll and Butes, and one of the things I'm extremely passionate about is making sure there's equity of opportunity for all our children and young people.
The pressure on the education system and the expectations on the education system are rightly growing with regard to the needs of our children and young people, and in order to ensure that we are meeting those demands and expectations, we require strong leadership. We require a strategic overview and oversight of what is going on within our settings, and somebody who ultimately can take the role in driving that forward without having to compromise their time trying to swap between roles of any given day. So I think one of the benefits of the school leadership proposals are that we will be able to really focus on developing leaders who lead and teachers who teach.
We're going to share some proposed changes to the way that schools are led in Argyll and Bute. And that's so that you'll be able to understand the proposals and give your feedback, because we're looking for input from all the parts of Argyll and Bute's community in order to shape these proposals before they're finally put to the Community Services Committee for a decision. First of all, we're going to look at some of the reasons why change is being proposed. And we're going to start off by looking at the national context. We know that there are major national education reforms coming, and Argyll and Bute needs to be ready for those. If you look on the right of the screen, you'll see a quote from the Scottish Government. That's from the Education Reform Joint Agreement. And it talks about how the national vision that they have for excellence and equity can't be achieved by one part of the system on its own. Everybody's going to have to collaborate and work together. Now, Argyll and Bute Council and the Education Services team are really aware that they're going to need to support school leaders so that they can contribute to this reform and implement the reform properly. And in order to do that, they know that they're going to have to ensure that the school leaders' strategic time is increased and is protected. And that ties in quite well with the Council's education vision that they published a while ago that promises to strengthen school leadership. And if we look at the situation in Argyll and Bute, the area faces a declining population overall. And there are some areas where population is actually rising, but they're outliers. The overall trend is downwards. And we know that our school rolls are falling even faster than the general population. If you look at the chart on the right, you can see that since 2001 up to the present day, there's been a 23% drop in the number of kids in our schools. And that's projected to keep on falling. Now, the council promises they're not going to close any schools, and they do aim to maintain schools in all the local communities. So obviously there's a challenge there if the number of children is dropping. And looking at the people leading our schools, at the head teachers, the deputy head teachers and the principal teachers, we know that school leaders tend to retire relatively early, especially head teachers, and that creates vacancies that we sometimes have difficulty filling. The Department for Education tell us that only 4.5% of head teachers across the whole UK work beyond the age of 60. And if you look at the figures on the right, you'll see that teachers at all of those levels in Argyll and Bute are generally over 50. Education Services team at the council are very aware that their recruitment needs are increasing as more and more leaders reach retirement age. And the EIS, who are the largest teaching union in Scotland, tell us that there's a recruitment crisis for head teachers, particularly in primary schools and particularly in rural areas, and that basically describes a lot of Argyll and Bute. Now, the number of applicants we receive for leadership roles are low. In fact, since January 2018 up to the present day, 15% of head teacher roles that have been advertised have failed to attract any suitable candidates and have had to be re-advertised and re-advertised. And many of the applicants that we do receive are failing to hold the standard for headship, which is another problem. And if we look at how our school leaders are spending their time, we know that they can struggle to find time to focus on leading and developing their schools. Again, if you look at the chart on the right, this is looking at the small schools in Argyll and Bute, which we're defining as less than 30 pupils. Now that's over a third of the schools in the area. Now the average head teacher in these small schools is having to spend 70% of their time teaching. Remember, that's the average, not the worst case. Now the obvious way to alleviate that is to hire more teachers, but under the current structure for schools, budgets won't allow us to do that. It seems fairly obvious that head teachers doing the work of a teacher for 70% or more of their time is not a good use of resources. Now, it's not as though the council are not willing to spend on education. If you can see the small footnote at the bottom of the screen there, they're spending 56% of their total expenditure on education already. So in order to try and face some of these challenges that we've outlined, the Education Transformation Board have a vision for what they want change to achieve. And the first part of that is to try and build capacity in school leadership, and that's about giving leaders more time to focus on continuous improvement and development at their schools. The second thing they'd like to achieve is to increase the appeal of leadership roles in Argyll and Bute schools, and one of the ways to do that is to improve opportunities for progression. And the third thing is that they want to try and build a formal structure for schools to collaborate and share resources more easily, and that's about improving equity of education. Hopefully, those things together will help us provide the best schools that we can. If we look at the way schools are currently led across Argyll and Bute, it's generally a single school with a single head teacher on site, who's then supported by the Education Services team at the council. Now there's some examples of shared headship, where one head teacher leads 2 or even 3 schools. And we also have some 3 to 18 schools where primary, secondary and early learning all work together. So our new proposal is to group nearby schools into collectives where a few schools work together. And this proposal is about building a collective leadership team who are embedded within the schools and work in the schools day to day. So these collectives will be based on shared geography and shared communities. Basically, it is nearby schools. And the collective model is flexible. So it can include different numbers of schools. It can include different types of schools like primary or secondary, denominational or Gaelic. And it can include larger and smaller schools. Now most of these collectives will probably be 4, 5 or 6 schools, but sometimes they could be larger or smaller. And this collective model should have a number of benefits. It'll build leadership capacity. It'll embed more senior leadership within your local schools and increase representation at the regional level. It'll empower leaders to focus their time on leading, and that'll be done by adding more teachers. And it'll create more opportunities for progression and the ability to build broader experience. And just to set out some ground rules before we show detail on this model, as a result of these proposals, there'll be no compulsory redundancies, there'll be no school closures, there'll be no reduction in the pupil-teacher ratio, and equally no reduction in pupil-teacher contact time. And there'll be no removal of the unique identities of each school. In fact, these proposals are designed to try and provide more sustainable schools, more teachers in classrooms, more equity of support resources, and ultimately strengthen school identities. And when we talk about more sustainable schools, this collective leadership model is designed to ensure that our schools can thrive as they face the challenges we talked about earlier. It will provide smaller schools with access to some of the resources of their larger neighbours. It will allow more teaching time to be delivered by dedicated teachers, instead of by the leaders who need to split their time and split their attention. And it'll increase opportunities for collaboration between schools by providing a structure that allows you to share resources and share best practices more easily. And when we say more teachers in classrooms, this model is designed to empower the school leaders to work together, managing a larger, dedicated teaching team between them. And it builds the opportunity for teachers who have a specialism, whether that's in something like science or drama or music, to support pupils across their whole collective instead of just within their single school. And when we say greater equity of resources, that's because this model is designed with sharing at its heart. The collective model creates economies of scale. Classroom resources, project resources, and even physical resources and equipment can be more easily shared. And the model encourages schools to capitalise on the remote methods that have been developed during the pandemic. And when we talk about strengthening identities, this model will embed slightly more senior leadership within your schools and within your communities. And this collective leadership team will be drawn from your existing local head teachers, the people who understand the individual schools and really value the communities and their identities. And this team will be empowered to keep building their schools together. They can capitalise on the unique strengths of each school to the shared benefit of all. Now obviously, we realise that the last couple of years have been really difficult for everybody, and for schools in particular. But we're talking about this now because we need to keep looking ahead and we need to keep thinking long term. These proposals are not about an overnight change, they're looking ahead 5, 10 years. And they're looking at the predicted challenges that we talked about earlier in recruitment and the evolving national agenda. And this collective model hasn't been designed in isolation. It's been developed specifically as a response to issues that are already being raised by head teachers. And if these changes are adopted, it will take time. The political decision on whether to go ahead with it or not won't be taken until at least August next year. And if the proposals do go forward at that point, there'll be a long transition period. It could easily be 5 years or more before the model is fully implemented. So we'll look at the model in a little bit more detail now. As we said earlier, this collective model is flexible. These collectives are intended to be diverse. They can include different numbers of schools, different types of schools, primary and secondary and so on, and they can include different sizes of schools. Each collective would be led by an executive head teacher, and they'd be running a team who each have a head of school role, and this team works together to lead the whole collective of schools. Each head of school runs their own school, and the team together run the collective. Now, the exact job titles and the responsibilities of each role are still being discussed with teaching unions. They could still change, but at the moment we're going with executive head teacher and head of school for the purposes of this film. Each head of school will also take on a specialism. Now, this could be specialising in an age group, like early years or first level or second level, or it could be in a particular field, like inclusion and equity, assessment, moderation, or Gaelic. Each head of school will be responsible for expert knowledge in that specialism across the whole collective. And one of the most important parts of this model is that these leadership roles are intended to be completely non-teaching. And that's about giving the school leaders the time that they will need to effectively lead a whole collective rather than a single school, and to be able to take on their own area of specialism. Now, we're not banning leaders from teaching classes completely. They'll still be able to do so if and when they choose, but it'll no longer be a defined part of their role. They won't have a contract that says you will teach 3 days a week. Now, it is important to recognise that Argyll and Bute is a very unique area. We have some very small schools, and there will be a few exceptions to this. Now, we're only talking about the very tiniest schools with 10 pupils or less, and even in those cases, the school leaders will have more time to think strategically and to develop their schools. They'll have reduced teaching time from what they have now. Now, the collective leadership team will be dispersed around the collective. They'll be working in the individual schools. Now, this ensures that every school has a leader on site, but it also ensures that the team are embedded in the schools that it leads, that they're there day to day, that they really understand the classrooms and the pupils. Now, the heads of school will also have their existing teams of staff, the deputy heads, the principal teachers, the teachers, and so on. They're all retained within their schools. Now, we're going to show you some working examples of these school collectives. Now, these are theoretical collectives, but they're realistic. They've been put together by the Education Services team, the Transformation Board, and the Budget Working Group. They've been fully costed, and the number of hours have been worked out. As I say, they're theoretical, but they're based on typical types of schools and typical sizes of schools that do exist in Argyll and Bute. Now, hopefully these examples will demonstrate that having a non-teaching leadership team strengthens school leadership, but also enables us to maintain, and in most cases even increase, the number of teaching staff. Now, if you look at the chart on the right there, this is a very simplified example, but it shows you how the executive head teacher works across the whole collective. Underneath them you have the heads of school working in their individual schools with their individual specialisms. And below them, within each school, the existing teams of deputy heads, principals and teachers. And you'll see that we're drawing a box around the leadership team, so you can clearly see which roles are non-teaching. And this example brings together 6 primary schools, starting with School A over on the left, which is the largest with over 200 pupils, and getting progressively smaller as you move across the screen, to Schools E and F, who each have under 30. Now, in the existing structure, Schools E and F would probably have a shared head teacher. That continues through into the new model with a shared head of school. You'll see that the executive head has been placed in School A. That's not because they're responsible for that school. The head of School A runs School A. But the executive head has to have an office somewhere. Further down the diagram, you'll see that there are different numbers of principal teachers in the different sizes of schools. And over on the right, you can see that we've totalled up the number of staff at each level, and compared that to the existing model just for reference. That should show you down at the bottom right that there is an increase in the number of classroom teachers. This example is a little more complex, and that's intended to show the flexibility of this collective model. So here we're bringing together 4 schools, 2 primaries and 1 3 to 18, which includes a primary and a secondary. You'll see these schools are slightly larger than the previous example. Schools A and B have under 100 pupils. School C is a primary with over 200, and the secondary School D has over 300. Now, because we're including a 3 to 18 school, this allows us to use their existing structures with their deputes, their senior deputes, their principal teachers. But you'll see that they're all brought into the non-teaching leadership team. Their time is freed up to properly support the executive head and the heads of school. And if you look down to the bottom right, you'll see that again this ultimately results in an increase in the number of classroom teachers. Now, looking at the role of the executive head teacher, they're actually part of the central team at Education Services, but they're embedded within the collective and within the schools. This is intended to close the gap slightly between the central team and the schools themselves. It brings greater representation, more responsibility, and more decision-making ability into your local communities. The head of school is intended primarily to lead their school, but they'll also be supporting the executive head in leading the collective. And then there'll also be an expert resource on their specialist area available to the whole collective. Now, the existing job sizing toolkits and methods will be used to make sure that they're appropriately salaried and appropriately set up with responsibilities, both for working across a multi-establishment collective and for working within their individual school. If you look at the bullet points on the right, those talk about the core responsibilities of a head of school within their school, and these should look very familiar to you because they're very similar to the responsibilities of a head teacher right now. It's about promoting leadership, good management, and strategic direction. It's about promoting high standards and providing professional advice, doing professional reviews, looking after the performance of the staff and supporting their continuous development. It's about taking responsibility for curriculum development, learning and teaching, and improvement planning. And it's about working in partnership with other schools and with parent groups.
The head of school will continue to fulfil that overall day-to-day responsibility for the good order of the school, for the maintaining of the high quality of learning experience for the children and young people. They will also maintain that role as the person who greets our children at the gate in the morning, who understands where our children are within their own learning journeys, maintains strong and close relationships with parents and carers, but also wider communities. One of the benefits to the head of school role is that they will also have that extra layer of support and expertise from the executive head working within that learning collective to support them and assist them to ensure that that particular school is continuing to maintain its improvement journey and achieving the best possible outcomes for all of our learners. Classroom teachers will continue to be employed to a setting. The continuity of those relationships is absolutely key. So at no point would the proposed structure infer or suggest that teaching staff would require to move around any more so than they may currently do. If someone's off on sickness absence, you may ask a teacher to help cover the class next door, but there would be absolutely no expectation of members of staff regularly having to travel around and work across a learning collective. The role of executive head within the new proposal is absolutely pivotal because you have the linkage there, that strong linkage with your staff in your schools and in your settings. You have that opportunity to continue to build and grow with your pupil and your parent bodies and your broader communities. But you also have the inroad to the work that is going on at local level, first and foremost, through the central education team within Argyll and Bute, but also the platform to be directly involved in regional developments with the Northern Alliance, our partners that we already have a very strong relationship with, but again also that platform into national developments and the opportunity to contribute to conversations at national level. So for me, the executive head teacher role is very much one of the strongest links in the chain here.
Now, the funding per school won't change. It can't change. But the collectives might have a little more flexibility in how their funding is used. The executive head teacher and the collective leadership team around them will have oversight across all the collected school budgets, and they can allocate some of that funding where it's needed, in exactly the same way that 3 to 18 schools work now. So the funding will come in separately for individual schools, allocated to each school exactly the same way it is now, but coming out of that will be shared resources, as well as resources for individual schools. And that's where the flexibility comes in. And when it comes to recruitment, more responsibility is going to sit locally within your schools within the collective. The executive head and the collective leadership team will have a really clear understanding of the overall recruitment needs of the collective because they're in the schools day to day. And the executive head will have the authority to make the case for recruitment. And when it comes to the practical side of recruitment, interview panels are going to be a lot easier to form because this non-teaching team already exists and includes all the necessary people. And day-to-day issues, the operational stuff that comes up every day in a school, will be handled by the head of school, exactly the same way it currently is by the head teacher. The head of school is the person who has the duty to know that school's pupils and know their families, and the ability to prioritise things. Anything that comes up is going to be initially handled by the person closest to the pupil, exactly as it is now, whether that's the teacher, the principal teacher, or whoever, and only escalated when necessary. Now, what's new in this model is that you'll have these specialists available within your collective who can be contacted for advice on their area. So, for example, if you have an issue with a child in primary 3, there might be a first level specialist who might be in a neighbouring school, and they can be consulted. And that doesn't need to be a difficult thing. It can be a phone call or an email ahead of a meeting you might be having with a parent. And heads of school are going to still be supported by their existing staff structures. All the deputies and PTs will still be there. Now, this collective leadership model that we've shown you would be a long-term goal. All existing head teachers are going to have opportunities in this new model, but nobody's going to be pushed into taking them. There'll be a slow transition, and there would be a hybrid leadership model in the meantime, driven by what the existing head teachers decide to do. And this is roughly what the timeline looks like. First of all, consultation within the sector. And this is about us sharing these proposals with head teachers, with schools, with teaching unions, and so on. And this is done so that we can gather feedback, and we can gather suggestions on how the model might be improved and refined, and made even stronger. The next step is doing the same thing with the local community. Sharing these proposals in the same way with parent groups, with community councils, with local employers, and so on. And again, that's about gathering feedback, about gathering opinions and feelings and suggestions, with the intention of making the model as strong as possible. All that feedback is delivered to the Education Transformation Board, to Education Services at the Council, so that they can revise these proposals and refine them, and make them as strong as possible, before they're presented eventually to the Community Services Committee. And they're the ones making the political decision on whether this is approved and whether we proceed with this model. If it does go ahead, if the vote does go that way, then initially that'll lead to this hybrid leadership model we mentioned, where some collectives have an interim leadership, including head teachers who've decided to stay in their current roles. And from there, that will progress eventually, slowly, to the pure collective leadership model, which is the end goal. Now, if these proposals are approved by the committee, and they do go ahead, the first step is going to be local consultation to help develop your individual school collectives. The Education Transformation Board and the central team would work with schools and with head teachers to develop collectives that work financially and practically, and make sure that they benefit the unique schools and their pupils. Recruitment for the leadership roles would be initially ring-fenced within each collective. So this collective leadership team would be made up of existing local head teachers, with all of their established expertise and local knowledge. And this is to guarantee that the new leadership team has the best interests of the individual schools at heart. Now, which roles are required within which schools and which collectives are going to be determined in the same way that roles are now. It'll be worked out based on the school roles, but also on the combined role of the whole collective. And they'll be job-sized and salaried appropriately, using the existing protocols. Now, anybody applying for the head of school role will be expected to meet the standard for headship, but it won't be 100% required. Anybody who takes on that role without the standard will be expected to meet it soon after, and they'll be supported to get there. Existing head teachers would have a few options under this model. Firstly, they could apply for the role of executive head to lead the entire collective. Or they could become head of school at their current school. Now, they won't be expected to reapply for that job. That would be enabled by job matching. Thirdly, they could apply to be head of school in a different school in the collective, because some vacancies may come up. Maybe because of someone being promoted up to be the executive head, or maybe because someone chooses to retire. Finally, they could choose to stay in their existing role as head teacher, and that's what leads to the hybrid model we talked about. So this is what the hybrid model would look like. Now it's important to say that anyone who chooses to stay in their existing head teacher role would not be excluding their school from the collective model. The collective would still be brought together, but their role as head teacher would adapt slightly so that they could work within a collective and work with the executive head. I would like to talk a little bit about the benefits that should come from this model. First of all, the benefits to the school leaders. They would have enhanced roles. Their roles would be non-teaching in most cases, and they'd have more local responsibility and greater national or regional influence. There would be the opportunity to lead a collective or lead a school. There would be far more non-teaching time to focus on doing that and on developing the school. There'd be the opportunity to own a specialism and to participate in a wider community of specialists. There'd be this more structured support network, both strategic and operational, from all your neighbouring local schools. And there'd be professional development that works across the collective. There'd be shared opportunities and increased opportunities for career progression. And because of the executive head role, there would be a stronger local voice in regional and national decisions. And if we look at the benefits to our schools, there would be more dedicated teaching staff, there'd be more equity of resources, and there would be leadership coming from within. Increasing the number of teaching staff speaks for itself. There'll be this more structured and better planned sharing of resources between schools, and this more flexible use of budgets that we talked about. There'll be specialist knowledge and expertise that's owned and shared within the collective, making it easier to share best practice. And there'll be an improved structure for day-to-day operational issues, because of these specialists being on hand locally to guide and advise. There'll be slightly more senior leadership embedded within your schools, with all the experience and local knowledge that comes from their old head teacher roles. And there'll be a more attractive recruitment offer, and a little bit more autonomy in your own individual recruitment decisions. And most importantly, we want to look at the benefits to the children and young people. We believe there'll be an improved education. There'll definitely be broader horizons, more consistency of teachers, and hopefully smoother progression. So we believe improved educational outcomes will be delivered by having stronger schools and more focused leadership. There'll be greater equity of access to education because of schools being able to share resources more effectively. Pupils will get more time with dedicated teachers who are focused on teaching and learning. We believe there'll be enhanced transitions between schools and between school levels because of this collective leadership team with a shared vision across multiple schools. And there'll be this very clear structure to address day-to-day issues, with specialist support that's embedded in the team and available locally. Ultimately, this is a model for school leadership that's been designed specifically for Argyll and Bute, and it should deliver the best education we can.
The new collective model is really exciting in terms of how resources can be shared across schools. If we have specialist staff in a collective, that member of staff can work across the different schools. It can work with our teachers in the different schools. That person would develop the knowledge and understanding of that member of staff, and ultimately that would benefit the children and the young people in that school.
One of the single biggest benefits of the proposed model for me is equitable provision for all of our children and young people. Whether we have a child accessing their education in one of our larger towns or in one of our smaller, rural, possibly island-based communities, there will be an equity of provision, but also an equity of experience for each and every one of them. The key function of the proposed leadership structures is to make sure that we are moving forward in an innovative and flexible manner. The proposed structures give us the flexibility to explore that in consultation with our broader communities. This is an innovative consideration. This is something which is forward-thinking, it's dynamic, it's flexible, it gives the autonomy and the ownership and the leadership back to the school communities, but ultimately it brings about the conditions which will create an equity and excellence of provision for all children and young people within Argyll and Bute.